Welcome, everyone.
All right, so we let Rob Hampson introduce our concept today, and then I will take over as moderator.
Thank you. Just as a little bit of background, every year I teach a course called Communicating Science, and the idea is to start working early on training the next generation of scientists to be able to communicate their work, their science, and that of others to the general public. In service of this, we usually do some public talks and tie in with a convention, usually the Congregate Convention, which is held in Winston-Salem or in High Point, North Carolina. Unfortunately, we can't do this year. So Tony Weiskopf and Bain Books have kindly agreed to help us set up and run a convention-like panel, virtual convention panel on science in science fiction. And after we have hear from our panel and our panelists, then the students in my class will be presenting 5-minute talks. We're calling them TED Talks with 2 Ds in honor of my former pen name, Ted Roberts. But I'm going to turn this over to Tony and let her introduce our panelists and get started on the science fiction part of the panel. Thanks. Tony, off to you.
Thank you, Rob. My name's Tony Weiskopf, and I'm publisher of Bain Books. We have the happy reputation for being very welcoming to hard science fiction, which is something that Jim Bain refused to call hard science fiction because he thought that was off-putting. And he said, call it real science fiction. And the definition for that is science fiction that has its inspiration and at its heart an interest in actual science, engineering, and technology. And of course, that's a fairly broad brief that can cover everything from biology to cosmology. And I like to think that we in our fiction get to do that. We've got a great panel here for you of science fiction writers and working scientists and engineers. So we will start with Arlan Andrews. I think Arlan is probably our elder statesman of the panel, and he is famous for many, many things, but closest to my heart is for describing rockets as the way God and Robert Heinlein intended, if I'm calling correctly. Arlan, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Retired engineer. I had my 80th birthday a few days ago, and so I am the elder statesman here. In the background, you can see a sign that says Sigma Workshop. That's a science fiction think tank I put together while I was working at the White House back in the early 90s. And a lot of people on this panel today are members of it, and probably others will be if they want to be. But that's what we do. I've written a lot of short stories, a few novels. Some I'm trying to peddle to Tony. And hey, plugs are plugs.
Absolutely.
But my fiction is typically short and humorous, like me. And we'll talk about it later, I guess. But my take on science fiction and science is just enough to make the story plausible and no more. Please don't make my eyes glaze over with explanations, unless you have to. If it's part of the story, sure. That's where I'm coming from.
All right. David Weber, I think if we're going in order of age, I think you're probably, not maturity, just age.
Hey, I'm only 67, okay, you know. I think Jim's older than me.
Jim Bell is shaking his head.
See? Yes. Okay, I am a historian, not a scientist by training. And I think it shows in what I prefer to write. I try to set anything that is going to have a lot of polonium in it, because you can do anything with the right isotope of polonium, far enough in the future that I can allow myself 1 or 2 pieces of magic, but then I try to make everything else work within our current understanding of how things work. Because
there's reasons for that, yeah. Which we'll delve into.
Yeah.
Some more.
But I would, because I write military science fiction, it's more hardware heavy, and that means I need to insert more background information so that the reader understands the tools that the military people have to work with. And I am somewhat infamous in some quarters for doing that.
All right, Jim. We skipped over you in terms of age. Can you let us know your technical background?
Certainly. Well, I am a registered professional engineer. I have operated in the nuclear field. I have operated reactors. I have designed them. I have built them. I have analyzed them. I've inspected them. I've decommissioned them. But I've crawled through a great many different energy facilities, both in real concrete and steel and in paper. Things from hydro dams to gas plants to coal plants to anything else. So really, I'd say I'm more of an energy engineer. And so I've written hundreds of documents that you can find my name on as an author. But because almost all of them have been nuclear safety inspection reports and nuclear analysis, I've tried my best to keep them nonfiction. And Tony, you've actually published some of my nonfiction science pieces. I haven't gotten any of my fiction past you yet, like Arlan here, but I'm going to keep trying.
All right. Fair enough. There's a lot more we're going to be asking you about. Rob or Chuck? I'm going to go with Rob.
Well, actually, I'm not supposed to be on this panel. My students get to hear me plenty.
All right.
So I'm going to lurk. In fact,
Okay.
I think I'll probably turn my camera off for now.
All right. Make faces or wave if you want to comment.
You're gonna make a Rob-shaped hole in the display, are you?
I don't think so.
All right, Chuck, you want to let us know your background then? I think it's more on the soft sciences side.
Well, it's kind of all on the many sides. It's, I guess, it would be the equivalent of a 12-sided cube. In that my degree originally is in creative writing, but then some of the first stuff I did with it was science writing, tech writing for pharma, and which I'll just leave it at that. And so I always had an interest in the hard sciences as well. And I think one of the reasons I was frequently brought in as the person who would look at a concept, a paradigm, and could then sort of turn it into something that was very often the people who understand those best are not always the best people to put them into humanly accessible narrative formats. So, and I always knew I wanted to do this since age 12. So, and it's interesting because what David was talking about regarding, and I'm a big fan of David's work, and in many ways, I think there's a lot of similarities, but there are also differences. I have a tendency, if there's near future, if you will, science fiction, which is a way of saying, sell it in 5 years because it's about to be overtaken by reality. And then you have the stuff that's set centuries in the future. I chose to tell my ongoing sort of epic, which is, I would say I'm more of an epic writer than a military science fiction writer. You can find books in the series that are definitely military SF, but others which are not so much. And my decision was to start it in about 100 years from now at a point where we are going through a number of changes. So I chose it specifically because the mentality of those people is still discernibly analogous to our own in a lot of ways, but it is right at the cusp of change. And so one of the things is I don't give myself exactly bolognium, but I'll put it like this. Anything that Mother Nature herself, Gaia, if you will, has not decided to explicate fully for us, I will drive a Mack truck through that little hole. So that's sort of the way I work the science in the hard science fiction that I write.
Cool. Cool. That's Charles Gannon. And we also have with us Les Johnson, who is a space scientist and who is a working space scientist. He both writes science fiction and flies solar sails. So tell us about your latest efforts in both of those.
Sure. Thanks, Tony. And Rob, I'm really glad you organized this online. I was in the panel last year at Congregate and really enjoyed hearing what your students had to say. So I'm really looking forward to what we're going to get to hear today. I'm a physicist. I write science fiction for Bain and pop science for both Bain and for different publishers. So I try to do science communication outreach as I do that. But in my day job, I am really a space technologist. I work for NASA at the Marshall Space Flight Center here in Huntsville, Alabama, where I do lead our efforts on solar sail propulsion, deep space propulsion. So in terms of science communicating, I have to leap in many different fields, often just like that, because in the science fiction, you want to tell a good story. And in the vein of what the other writers here were saying, I don't know that I'll use balonium. I'll use credibolinium, or at least I try to, because it really it jars me out of a story sometimes if there's just something blatantly impossible. But I'm willing to suspend disbelief for really good stories. And since nature, as Chuck has said, has left us some Mack trucks to drive through, I really enjoy reading those where people drive through them in a consistent way. And I try to write stories that make it believable that we might actually find a way to jump through some of these loopholes that nature's provided us. So, yeah.
Oh, I think that leads to my first question to the panel, which is why write hard science fiction, right? Why go to the trouble of having to learn all this science when you can just make everything up? Arlan, what's the point of it?
Well, the point is credibility, the suspension of disbelief. We have a lot of technically educated people anymore. Hopefully, some basic science in schools from the first grade on. And so if something is really bad, like Les mentions, that's really stupid. I read a book, tried to read a book recently. A comet was going to impact Earth. The comet was in the Earth's orbit. Okay, well, where? It could be another side of the sun. I mean, it never explained anything like that. It turned me off. Of course, I've got a doctorate in engineering and look at things a little bit differently, but the ordinary person reading a story needs to have enough background, to me, just enough scientific background to understand what's being said. I watched a movie last night on television, War of the Worlds, The True Story, narration by H.G. Wells. It was cool. In there, he talks about, it's an iconic science fiction story. He talks about heat rays and giant robots and no explanation whatsoever. There's no science in it. There's a lot of technology, but you accept it in the context of the story. And so as far as I'm concerned, all you really need is enough to explain it in the context of the story. The story I'm working on, the trilogy I'm working on, takes place 30,000 years from now after the next ice age. Yeah. So naturally, I had to learn a little bit myself about glacier formation and some solar eruptions and uplift topology or in the seabed and that sort of thing. But the characters 30,000 years from now live in a kind of a medieval world. They come across ancient technology, which is in our future. They don't understand it. An old artificial intelligence tries to explain it to them. They still don't understand it. So I call it hand wavium. There's enough hand wavium in there. Okay, we tried to describe what's going on, but the characters experience it.
Right.
They experience it, and use it, and everything else is background.
Well, you talk about having to learn about plate tectonics and glaciers and all that kind of stuff. You don't have to, right? You could have just made it up. You could have just, oh, well, I know how, ice works and just gone from there. And a lot of people do that. But the reason that you don't, and I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt there, is because it's fun to learn this stuff. Because that's one of the pleasures of hard science fiction is indulging our interest in these matters. So, Les, how do you get some of your science interests into your fiction?
Well, I mean, one of the things, the adages I read and heard as I began my writing about 10 years ago is you write what you know. So in the early fictional works that I wrote about, there just happened to be solar sails in some of the stories, just randomly occurred, right? But for me, answering the question of why we put it in there, I go back to what inspired me to study physics, which is in large part reading good science fiction. And the gee whiz, the wonder, the excitement, and the story of people in this posited future, right? So it's for me, it's like becoming 12 years old again, because I do get to learn new things. In the book I'm writing right now with Travis, I've had to learn new things. With Travis Taylor, we've got a trilogy we're working on the first book of for Tony, and it's required me to learn some radio communications information, because I really didn't know anything beyond the fundamentals, and it's been really fun. And so as a writer, I enjoy learning, and as one of the things that I do at conventions, that if you've ever heard any of my talks, I enjoy taking the complex and trying to make it understandable by the person who's not an expert. And if I could get the charge that I get in a book from what I get from seeing in the audience when the light bulb goes off and they say, "Oh, I understand."
Yeah.
I want to have that same effect in my writing when the reader's reading the book and they're in the story and something happens and they learn something and they go, "Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that." That to me is a gratifying thought.
Yeah. Chuck, have you gotten to put some of your passions and things that you're interested in just exploring because they're so cool in your fiction?
In the interest of brevity, there are a few that I have not. I think both fantasy and science fiction can be said that their sense of wonder, as we put it as a single word in our field, is absolutely essential to keep a reader there. I think to keep ourselves there. But then, to me, one of the things about science fiction is this is a place, particularly I think as a writer, if you are a mind forever voyaging, this is pretty much your vehicle. Because of all of the things you will learn, all the things you learn you don't know anything about, and if what you like is to challenge all the things you know, to reconceive things you thought you knew in light of an entirely new field of study, this is the place to do it. And for me, I think there's absolute value of all kinds with all of the different branches of fantasy and science fiction and whatnot. But I think hard science fiction is not just saying, here's a cool story. I mean, this is probably one of the largest distinctions between space opera, which I think really focuses on cool story. And it ought to. I mean, it's almost sort of there in the title. Space opera doesn't have to ask questions, and I think this almost goes right back to what you were saying at the very outset, Tony, which is that hard science fiction basically holds itself to certain rigor, different degrees of it, to ask questions while it's telling, hopefully, a kick-ass story as well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why hard science fiction has a universal appeal. It goes beyond national borders. It goes beyond all kinds of borders, because we're all explorers. We're all we all have this sense of inquiry. Now, sometimes we get it beaten out of us at a young age, but I think that's one of the reasons why this kind of opening up of your brain and this kind of inquiry brings us back to the joys of childhood, because it takes us back to when we were all explorers and when we were all figuring out the world. David, do you find that that's some of the things that you enjoy when you're writing your fiction?
Yeah, I do. I think that there's another really important reason to at least try to grasp the essential science, which is continuity.
Yeah.
If you're writing from what is actually happening, then continuity is sort of self-assured. If you're inventing it as you go along, then continuity is not guaranteed. I think that space opera and real science are not necessarily mutually exclusive. I think they can be. I think that the best of both types sort of cross-pollinates a little bit. That the best of the science the real science fiction partakes of that sort of that grand scale of story, and the best of space opera at least tries to get the basic science right when you're producing it. I have to say that, as you pointed out, I am not exactly the youngest person in this panel. And when I started writing science fiction, Al Gore had not yet invented the internet. And the ability, while I am writing, to jump over and start doing research on something that I didn't know about is addictive. Okay, and it is one of the things that draws me into the field. It always was. It's just now I get I get closer to instant gratification on my addiction now than was possible earlier. But I think all of the points that have been raised, from the fact that we are dealing with a more technically literate readership who are going to call us out if we are gratuitously wrong, and the education, the inspirational aspect of it. I know at least one person, for example, who decided to pursue a naval career because of what I was writing. And I know that there are other people out there who are deciding to pursue careers in the hard sciences because of what some of the other folks out here are writing. And that's one of the things that good fiction does.
I think so, and I think it's actually one of the jobs of science fiction is to do that, is to mediate between this artificial barrier that people have erected between the arts and science, and to let people know that that boundary is eminently pushoverable
And artificial.
And artificial.
Yeah.
It should be instructive to us to note that the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, kind of interesting titles, refused to separate them. So maybe, so hopefully the old will become new again, and we'll learn some of that wisdom perhaps.
Well, I think that's, like I say, I hope that's one of the things that science fiction does, and I think it's important to do that. Which is not to say that Pax Gregory Benford, that that's the only thing that science fiction should do. It obviously isn't. Science fiction is a big house, but I think it is one of the things that it should do. So let's talk about info dumps. Arlan was starting to expound on that, and his approach is just the littlest amount that you need to make sure that the reader understands the story. But Jim, how do you feel about info dumps in your fiction?
I think this is related to your first question, which is hard science fiction is something that all of us are living in real world time. That is, right? All of us who are readers are operating equipment which would have been science fiction not long ago. So it's a very easy, objective and subjectively both, to consider that you as a character could be getting into and operating some of the equipment that are in the science fiction stories, even if it's far in the future, because all of the people who are reading and who have read recently are operating technologies which were science fiction not long ago. Now, on your question of info dumps, there is a tension between being immersive in your details, because the more details you get right, the more you get your science right, the more you draw your reader in and make your reader believe everything else you're going to be doing. Yep. And the more you get right, the more the story holds together. But as Arlan said, you do too much of that and eyes will glaze over. So it's when you write a science paper or analysis, the very first thing you do is you write in layman's terms what happened. You give the executive summary. Right. At the conclusion, you go back to layman's terms to explain what it is you did. But in between, you write all the technology of balonium, whether it's real or whether you're trying to make it real, depending on whether it's science or science fiction. So science fiction novels do much the same thing, it would appear, if they're hard science fiction. You draw the person into the story, and then the story eventually resolves without a deus ex machina technology. But then in the middle, you have your technology bringing you in. Just don't get your stuff wrong. And if you do something crazy, you better explain it. If you start your story off with you're orbiting a cubical planet, you better explain it.
Imagine a cubicle cow. Is that? Yeah. All right. Well, that's fair enough. Do we have any fans and any defenders of the info dump? David, I'm looking at you.
Well, okay. I think that I have readers who say, I read your Honor Harrington books for the politics and the human interaction, and I don't pay any attention to the info dumps. I have other people who say, I love the info dumps because it gives me, gets me my hard head, my hardware head engaged, and it tells me what's going on. There is a balance that needs to be maintained between them, and I don't know that I always hit that balance correctly. I am, especially in my last few years of stuff that I've written, I have been trying to pay more attention to hitting that sweet spot between the explication and what's going on. But I think that an info dump can be carried by a strong story, and that the info dump can then enrich the experience for the people who are into that kind of thing. Yep. And so there is a point at which you need to make technical information available to the reader. Ideally, you should be able to do that by incorporating it into the flow of the novel. Sometimes you can't. That's especially true if you are structuring an entire military capabilities system that the readers don't have access to. And I simply feel that doing it in an info dump is superior to having a lot of, as you know, Bob, passages in the book.
I mean, it's basically another literary device, right? You
Yes.
can use it to change pace. You can use it to change viewpoint, and it's another tool in the writer's toolbox.
It is, but it's one that needs to be employed judiciously.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's true of most writers' tools, but this one, I think, in particular, you need to be careful where you deploy it in the course of the story.
I think that if I can, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things, and I think I've seen David do this, if my memory is correct, and so I only steal for the best. I did it in my first novel as well, my first solo novel, I should say. There's a it's not faster than light, and there's actually people correct each other on that. It's a field effect drive, but the only time it's explained is actually about 2/3 of the way through the book, when they have a first contact encounter and they see another ship with entirely different signatures, and they say, "How the heck is it doing that?" And that leads to, in order for people to understand, suddenly the explication of how that drive works, the one that you've been seeing throughout the book, becomes necessary, both to move the action forward and because now hopefully people become curious enough, and now the reader is saying, wow, these folks are in trouble, and why are they in trouble, and what's so different about this, and what's dangerous about it? So I think if you can tie the first, item one, don't explain everything. Know what really needs to be explained, and sort of have a checklist in your head, and then find a place to make it dramatic, where it actually answers a question that has become important to the reader. And at that point, I think people tend to not even see the info dump, particularly if people are arguing about it, which is the way I set it up, that people are arguing about it.
Which actually brings me to my next question, which is, I think, science fiction as a genre is uniquely placed to do, which is to show how science is achieved. And arguing about things is one of the way that science is achieved. And different cultures do science differently. And I think one of the things that science fiction does is provides us with a historical example of how cultures look at science. Les, you want to talk a little bit about how you have working scientists in your fiction? So you're drawing on your experiences in your fiction to do that. Am I right?
You are, and one of the challenges I have, because you say these arguments, I would boil it down to interminable, unending meetings.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and the process of science, engineering, and technology development is hours, days, weeks, months of intense analysis, meetings, and I'm sorry, sometimes just the monotony, and it's kind of boring. And then you go into a test, and it's 24 hours of intense excitement and potentially disaster as you're waiting for the outcome of the test. So you go along at this chronic level and you're saying, okay, I've got to do this. Why am I doing this again? And then you get to the test, and it's a make or break time, and the adrenaline goes up and the excitement pumps, and you see whether your analysis was right and everything held together, or whether it all shook apart on the shaker table, right? And so in the fiction side of it, you don't want to bore everybody to death with endless meetings, right? So a challenge I've always had is in trying to make the process of discovery and innovation, and how you take something from an idea where the scientist or the protagonist then has to go implement it. You know, in a lot of fiction, it's just glossed over. It's like, oh, okay, and then they have it. Well, it's not that simple. Yeah. And it can take a lot of time. And I've struggled with that, because I'd like to make it believable without boring everybody.
I think somebody who did that really, really well was Jim Hogan.
Yeah.
In his scientists working out how they're going to solve the problems. If that didn't get you excited about becoming a scientist, I can't think of anything that did.
Yeah, for sure. So I think showing the process of how science is done is one of the things that science fiction is supposed to do, and that changes as how we approach science changes. I mean, I read and listen to a lot of old time radio and early science fiction pulp stories, and the perception of the mad scientist from the 20s, 30s, and 40s is very different from our idea of what a scientist is now. And that's part of what it is that science fiction mediates. The other thing that science fiction, I think, is again uniquely positioned to do is deal with ethical questions. I think there's a commercial on TV night right now that has the famous conundrum. Yes, we're talking about if we can do it. We should be talking about should we do it. Arlan, does your science fiction attack that question at all about technology and about pushing forwards the boundaries of science?
Strange you should ask that. Let me point out this book.
Our first commercial.
Actually, the second one. Actually, ethical questions. It has to do with cartels in the future in South America, owning South America as an outright criminal state. And people in the United States with nanotechnology. The president is a woman, and she authorizes a strike against them, and it all backfires, and really messy things happen. It's all ethics, but that's all background. It happens real quickly, and the rest of the story is trying to clean up the mess, and it has to do with people. The other one, an ethical one, was another novel, Valley of the Shaman. It's hard science fiction, I maintain. Other people have called it New Age, but it has to do with parallel worlds. The science in it is just hand-wavium about parallel worlds and alternate timelines and that sort of thing. But the people do experience it, and it's all background. There's a lot of ethics in there. They go into ancient cultures, really gruesome rituals and beliefs, and how that affects the modern world and the parallel worlds. It's all, everything I write becomes a mess at some point for the characters. You really put them through hell, and sometimes they survive and sometimes they don't. But it's always, to me, it's always ethical. It might be humorous, but it's ethical. I have a story. And this, you can't see it. The Uranus Planetary Anthology series. It's a quick short story. a guy invents a holographic projector that generates 6-inch high 3D models for your desk or for toys. But he plays around with it. He understands that once he gets the sunlight with different wavelengths, and you have to explain wavelength differences here, he can generate holographic 3D models the size of buildings. Now, when taggers, the young people who like to go out and use spray paint, get a hold of these, guess what? They can put out three-dimensional things the size of buildings, and they're not always nice, safe for workspace.
Gotcha.
So that's enough of an explanation. It's hand-wavium, polonium, or whatever you want to call it, but it sounds reasonable. But it is ethical. What happens? This guy gives this to these street gangs, and they go out, and instead of tagging, they make some really obscene things happen. That's fun. That's the fun of science fiction. Your characters discover things you don't even know when you're writing about them.
Well, I think that's what science fiction can do. It can look ahead, see the things that are going to potentially be plausible, and then have us ask the question: do we want these things?
Well, I would say too that any good fiction is going to pose ethical questions.
Yeah.
What science fiction is particularly well suited to is posing technocratic ethical questions. One of the ones, for example, that I think, because I concentrate on military science fiction, at what point do you want to put AI into the control loop on kill, don't kill decisions? At what point do you make sure that there's still a human who can press the button and say, no, we don't blow up the school with the school teachers and the kids in it just because the guy we think is a terrorist walked in the door? So yes, I think definitely good fiction, any fiction, grapples with those ethical questions, but science fiction is especially well suited to grappling with a specific subset of them. That doesn't mean we don't do universal questions in there as well. We just have a better window into one particular area of it than a lot of other forms of fiction do, I think.
That concern about AI is a big concern right now in governments around the world. The Chinese and Russians have a completely different viewpoint of it than we do.
I know.
I'm actually going to make a plug for an upcoming science fiction novel coming out from Bain sometime probably in 21 or 22 by James Campbell. It's called The Godel Operation. Godel Operation, which deals with a future rife with believable AIs. And that is one of my pet peeves, is that so many people use AI as a Greek chorus and don't actually bother to even try to get an understanding of how these systems work. Check your sympathizing.
No, that was yeah, because I see the same thing, and it very often is foundational stuff. We're talking, we in part, I would say, our intelligence arises intrinsically through biological needs and communal activity. There's almost, you could try to impose that on an AI, but if you can't, what it would do with us, how it would perceive itself, to me, and here we get into the history of AI, I think one of the best things about this, you go back to the 60s, there was a novel which became a film called Colossus the Foreman Project, which gets into this question of, if you can have intelligence and it can be relatable to some degree to a human, but if it comes from an intrinsically different place, it may have an entirely different view on and to just stay on the ethics thing, one of the reasons I wanted to go at that sort of middle future is it's not just can you do it, as you were saying earlier, as I think two people have said, it's there are some things that if you can't distribute them equally, what is the unintended effect of that going to be? For instance, let's say, I'll give you an example, and this is a part of my series which I haven't even gotten into yet, because it actually happens a little bit in the past, and it's why certain things are not more advanced. People will take a look at my fiction, they say, why aren't people running around with cybernetic this, that, and the other thing? Well, there's a reason for that, and it's that 20 or 30 years before, there were upgrades. Upgrades were hackable. Upgrades were subject to EMP. And the upgrades came along because those were the answers by nations that were not able to be part of either of the cloning upgrades. choosing what your children, designer children. And in that, you have a split between CRISPR, which seems great, or the Gattaca model, which is probably more expensive. You start getting into those questions, and now it's who gets what, how much can a state pay, how much can an individual pay? You're getting down to really basic questions about the haves and have-nots in any given nation and across the globe. And
Yeah.
so I think that hard science fiction would have to work very hard to escape it, if
Yeah.
you will.
Yeah,
Question-
we're talking about biology here at this point,
Yeah.
bioengineering,
Yeah.
and this goes back in science fiction to the Isle of Dr. Moreau, right? When you're talking about wells and so
But I think
Yeah, go ahead.
we're looking more at those areas now than we certainly were in the 60s and whatnot.
You'll find
well,
plenty of examples of this.
No, I'm not saying you're not going to find plenty of examples. What I'm saying is that the frontier that a lot of science fiction is looking at now is more biometric than physics.
Okay.
In a lot of ways from where it was. I wanted to ask, because I couldn't remember, I still can't remember, what was the novel that Jim Hogan did about the artificial intelligence they built the space station for? I think it was a
I remember
Bain
what the
book.
cover looks like. Well,
Yeah.
we ended up reprinting most, if not all, of Jim's fiction in the 90s.
Yeah.
Christopher will have to look it up for us, but
Yeah.
yeah.
You know the one I'm talking about.
I do.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, Arlan's talking about multiple worlds being hand wavium, but in Paths to Otherwhere, Hogan laid out the scientifically more or less plausible hole that we can use to make multiple worlds hard science fiction. There's more and more argument, at least in physics circles, that this is not just a mathematical artifact.
Thank you, Robert.
Is it the Two Faces of
Robert
Tomorrow?
found it. The
Okay,
Two Faces of
beat me to it.
Tomorrow. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, there it is.
I
All
will
right,
withdraw.
Two Faces of Tomorrow. Yeah. Hogan was fantastic in that, but he was also working on grounds that earlier science fiction writers
Tony,
had
can I
plowed.
break in for just a second here?
Yeah, go for it.
John Campbell, when he took over the analog, he really pioneered a departure from gadget science fiction, where that was all about the gadget, to all about the effects of the gadget. One of the quotations I've seen attributed to him is, "Fine, you've invented an atomic chicken plucker. Don't tell me how it works. I don't want to know. Tell me what the effects are on the market. What does it do to chicken pluckers who do it by hand? What does the price of chicken go down? What are the ethical and the societal impacts of it?" That's what he wanted the story to be about. Even John Getz, he made revolutionized science fiction for that reason.
Absolutely, and I think this points out too where Rob's class and our panel intersect, which is not just communicating science ideas to the public, but why do we want to do that? And Les's job is one of those reasons, right? We want to persuade people to pay for this stuff.
Oh yeah. Well, I have to make a comment there, Tony. I've said this many times, and I'm not too terribly embarrassed to admit this. When it comes to being a physicist at NASA, I am not the sharpest stick in the stack. Okay, there are a lot of people that are a lot sharper, a lot quicker, a lot more innovative than I am. But I have been blessed with the ability to communicate at various levels the importance of the projects I'm working on, and that's enabled me to get the funding I need to pursue those projects. And that's why whenever we have, in my day job at NASA, when we have interns come in for the summer or for the semester who are engineers or scientists, one thing I tell them when I give them my gee whiz lecture about solar sails and laser sails to go to the stars is that they should go take a communications class, how to give a talk. If they don't feel comfortable doing that in their academic career, join what they consider to be something adults do, which is Toastmasters. Learn how to communicate at a level people can understand, because that's how you sell your project. That's how you get the funding to do what you want to do, right? And I think that'll work in the venture capital world, the boardroom, the NASA room. It works everywhere. And it's a sales pitch to you too, right? How do you communicate over dinner at a con, your next book idea? You've got to be able to communicate it quickly, succinctly, and target it for the person that you're talking to. And that's extremely important.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
please,
mean, I think yeah, go ahead, Arlan. Yeah.
please, all you students, pay attention to what Dr. Johnson said there. Learn to write, learn to speak. I worked at Bell Labs for many years, and a large percentage of my colleagues were almost illiterate when it came to writing. It was pitiful.
Yeah.
They finally made us take a course called Put It in Writing, which I took about 3 or 4 times just for the practice. You learn to write exactly what the customer needs, whoever the customer is, your boss or your client or whoever. But so many people, technical people who were educated back in the 50s and 60s, were poor writers, poor speakers, poor writers. And like Les said, you don't get the funding, you don't get the promotions. And besides that, it's fun. And maybe you'll become a science fiction writer too.
Well, clarity of expression and the ability to communicate are critical to anything you're going to do in life in a lot of ways. I mean, they're critical to getting the funding. They're also critical to convincing people why what you're doing needs to be done, not just getting the funding for it. And the very first way that you're going to be communicating with almost anybody is going to be in writing. Okay, unless you have somebody who is going to say, here, I want you to talk to this brilliant young or old person. The original communication is most likely to be in writing. And if the writing is, if it's grammatically wrong, okay, that's enough to cost you a whole bunch of credibility and interest right there. The ability to clearly and concisely state what you need to state is just absolutely critical. And I would argue that it's as critical in a spoken presentation as it is in a written presentation.
Yeah.
I did a
And
couple
I think science fiction makes the argument, no matter what kind of science fiction it is, that science fiction is inherently hopeful, that there is going to be a future.
Yes.
Whether or not you're writing a dystopia, which is saying there is going to be a future, it could go here, let's not do that, or whether it's there is going to be a future and it's going to be fantastic and this is where we should go.
Yeah.
Just the act of writing science fiction is inherently hopeful, and that is a useful thing to be able to communicate right here, right now.
Well, I've always said that science fiction is a technocratic ageist fairy tales. It does exactly what fairy tales used to do. It tries to explicate, it tries to set a world in context. It's just that we are no longer doing it in mythological or pre-science terms. We don't have elves. We have
Vampires.
clones. Whatever, you know. Yes, and they aren't really vampires, Tony. Yeah. But what I'm saying is that cautionary tales, inspirational tales, you know, it's the same thing. We're just doing it. We're talking to a different society, and we're doing it in different terms, but we're fulfilling much the same function.
And we are creating heroes. Yeah, go ahead, Chuck.
Riff off that for a second. As taking it just that step further, or an additional step, I guess you could say. To me, hard science fiction, it is sort of like building a cow with fins to have what I would call inherently pessimistic science fiction. Because science fiction really, it's right there in the word science, right? And if you think about the origins of science as we think of it today, empirical method, logical positivism, all of those sort of things. The bottom line is that this is tied, it's joined almost at the hip to the notion that we can do this. We don't have to wait for something else to do it. We can do it. As a matter of fact, you might say it's on us. And that there's a sort of motivational aspect to it that I think is, whether it's a failure or a success, the idea is there's a process, and this process has made this reality. And as I think it was Arlan who was saying earlier, we're living hard science fiction. The stuff that we're communicating right now is would have been the stuff of total wonder just half a century, 60 years ago. And I think that
I remember it well.
and I want to tie that to the students who are watching, because if you're not, so you don't want to be a science fiction writer. Okay, good. Because the bottom line is, we need you guys. We need you guys to actually go and build that future. But I think what I would say is, if you can take a science fictional mentality with you into the science field, this is the natural handoff, if you will, from people like us who are coming up with these ideas that aren't too bounded, but the idea is the thing, not the frame, not the cage, the physics cage entirely. But somebody's going to have to transmit it from there to cutting iron, cutting metal, as they say. And I think today's scientists have got to be those people. Absolutely. So you're a very important part, if not the most important part of this process, I think.
All right, fantastic. I think we're going to go to Q&A from the audience. I think Rob's got some questions that he'd like to ask the panel. So,
I'm actually, I'm going to Chuck's comments and everybody else's comments right now are a great lead-in for one of the audience comments right away was that science fiction inspires the dreamers to become creators, and I love that. I wrote that down.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. We were going to steal that one. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, Christopher, do we have questions from the audience, or?
Yeah, so we have we just have a couple so far. The first one was for Les in particular. Where do you see space exploration going within the century?
Wow, within the century. We're lucky we're early in the century. I got lots of room to speculate. I think we're in the beginnings of the commercialization of near-Earth space. I think we're going to see very, very soon now the dream of private individuals who have the means being able to go take vacations, go as a tourist to near-Earth space. I think we're going to see multiple countries of the world establishing bases on the moon, outposts in orbit and beyond. I think if we play our cards right, by the 2030s, we could see people go to Mars. I think that's a little bit more dicey. I've been expecting that my whole life. But I think the capabilities are certainly with us now to do that. We just have to have the will to decide to do it. And I also think we're going to be sending ever more complex robotic spacecraft to explore all over the solar system, and maybe even take that first step out beyond the edge of the solar system to build the telescopes that'll look at some of the extrasolar planets.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, the other answer, another fictional answer to this is Rich Man's Sky, coming out in April next year in hardcover by Will McCarthy. Yeah.
This is more of a literary question than a scientific one, but we had one reader ask all of our panelists if you could work with any writer, science fiction writer, living or dead, who would it be and why? Maybe something that you could talk a little bit about your writing.
It would be Robert Heinlein, but it will be different reasons for every one of them.
I think that's fair.
I'll be right back. Sorry.
Yeah. I actually kind of got a chance to work with one of the guys that I would have put on that list when Phil and I finished Mamelukes for you, Tony, because Jerry I had always hugely admired, and the opportunity to get involved in that whole series was huge to me. I would have loved.
Jerry Pornell was the author there. Yeah.
But if I don't think we can pick any of us just one. I mean, besides Bob, that we'd love to have worked with, because there were so many.
Les Johnson got to work with Ben Boba.
Oh, that was what I was going to mention. That was really one of the high points of my adult life. Because having read his stuff back when I was being inspired to study physics, I mean, Ben Bova was like the dean of science fiction in the late 70s to all the way through the 80s when I was in school. And when I had the opportunity to co-author Rescue Mode with him a few years ago for you, Tony, that was just an amazing opportunity. And I learned a lot and had a lot of fun, and learned a lot about the craft of writing. Got to work with an extremely nice and visionary person, and it was really a wonderful experience.
He would
How about,
definitely be on the short list for anybody.
how about you, Jim? What living or dead science fiction writer would you
Well, pretty
like
much
to
has to be
collaborate?
Robert Hyman. The
Yeah.
thing about Robert Hyman that it really always struck me is he would take a certain slender amount of technology and make a visionary world out of it in the future that I wanted to live in. In fact, sometimes I thought he had been there and he'd come back to tell about it. He really brought you into the story and made it believable. And I really treasure that in a story because he didn't make a whole lot of scientific hardware leaps. He just used them so well. That's what I really like about it.
How about you, Arlan?
John W. Campbell Jr.
Yeah,
I met
because
him.
he was a writer too.
I met him, and actually Isaac Asimov introduced me to Campbell at the Lunacon in 1971, I think it was. I'd gone there just to meet him. I actually tried to sell him a couple of stories, which he bounced, and I have a collection of letters from him in which he was chewing me out for some of the things. I'll have to post those someday.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd like to have worked with him. I'm looking right now. A friend gave me a lot of old astoundings from the 1940s and 50s. And they are old and decrepit, and they break when you read them. And I have them already in the collection, but I won't read them for that reason. But I'm going back now with these secondary copies that I have and reading all the 1940s and stuff all the way through. And I see Campbell's editorials. Jim was talking before about Campbell's extrapolating technology into ordinary life. I've just read about the first report of a V2 rocket in Astounding. Somebody had reported, wrote about it. And Campbell's first thing was, okay, now that's interesting and fun. We figure out how it works. What is going to be the effect when they have a 12,000 mile range V2?
Mm.
What effect is that going to have on global politics? And that's the kind of thing that he was so good at. And I really admired. And the older I get and the more I read of his stuff and the more I admire him. He was eccentric, but he was my mentor more than Heinlein even. He was my mentor when I was reading science fiction first in the 1950s. The quirky way of thinking. You mentioned before how a science fictional attitude, Chuck, comes into play in everything. The science fiction attitude is one thing that stood me out from all my peers and colleagues at Bell Laboratories in San Diego when I was there. Because when they got down to the sticky parts, they would always, many times, came to me for a blue sky, off the wall type of creativity. And they told me that, Arlen, we've come to dead end. Can you think of something? Now I wasn't always right, or I would have wound up running the place. But I was right enough, and I always credit it to the people. I said, "You're coming to a science fiction fan. I'm a science fiction fan, and that John Campbell and Heinlein and Asimov and Bradbury and Clark, these people are responsible for the way I think, and I give them all the credit because they were especially Campbell. He was my mentor."
Yeah. How about you, Chuck? Who would be your collaborator?
So I'm going to put a bunch of names to the side simply because they've been done a lot here. I'm an advisory member on the Highland board, so I think we know where some of my interests are there. There are a couple of names. One name which would be very, very, I'd like to write with Wells, but I'm not sure Wells, because I loved his ability. Big idea science fiction. I mean, huge big idea science fiction. But I think to some degree it was a possibility of its time. I think that as we move forward, we feel the constraints more that's one of the things about science is we know more. We also realize we know less. But the scope of what we know and where we don't know, it kind of we look at a lot of Wells now. We say, well, that probably wouldn't happen, or not the way he thought about it. But boy, what he was talking about socially or in terms of human possibility is undiminished by the passage of time, in my opinion. The other person that I would like to write with, and it would be a whole session as to why, is Poole Anderson. Poole Anderson is a beautiful writer. My favorite short piece of fiction. No offense to anybody here, those alive, those dead, looking on if such a thing happens. There's a novella he wrote called Kings Who Die, which was in 1967. I saw it in a Merrill collection not at that exact time, but foreseeing man-machine interface, AI interface, the specialization of the military and the costs that would put in. It's the sort of cyberspace, if you will. It's all there in a 1967 novella of maybe 25,000 words. I mean, and the poetry of his language, singular. So that's
great. Yeah, well, it's great to bring him up again.
Yeah.
Many of his books are available at Bain.com. Yeah, go ahead. Next question.
Yeah, hang on. I just lost it. There we go. Okay. Marissa asks, and she says this may be a silly question, but how do you get a writing mentor? Some of you've talked about mentors here.
It is harder in the age of COVID when we don't have science fiction conventions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a large part of science fiction mentoring comes from the social interaction that we get at conventions, but also at writers' workshops. And some of those writers' workshops I know are going online. So hopefully we will at some point get through this. But
I think you also get a certain degree of mentorship through the written word that you're looking at. That you can learn a lot if you think analytically, not just in terms of I enjoyed this or I didn't enjoy this, about what you're reading and who you're reading stories by. And
who's sharing your headspace?
Exactly. One of the things that I tell people at writing workshops is that it's the writer's individual voice that creates the story that writer tells. And the voice that you have is a product of the voices of every writer you ever read, because there are bits and pieces of all of them in the DNA of your writing voice. You simply have to be sure that what you do is a synthesis and not a pastiche. You need to assemble those components in your own mind, in your own writing style, so that the stories that you produce are yours. But you have to recognize that you learned your craft from everybody else you ever read.
Can I add one quick thing? Because I know we want to move on to the student presentations.
Yeah.
There's a real tendency, I think, today in online and other reviews, which is that they're good reviews, it strikes me, do two things. You want the subjective assessment of the person doing the review. And I'm talking now this as every reader is a reviewer when you get right down to it, because you're deciding how you like the book. But there are two parts to that. I think that it's important to remember, and it's important as I think the development of your craft. If you don't like the topic, if you don't like the opinions of the reader, fine, good, put it aside. But that's different than saying it's a bad book. A bad book, arguably, is one that is not well executed, assuming that it has done one of the most important things, which is established with clarity what it's trying to achieve. Yeah. Good writing that achieves what it's trying to achieve is always worthy of note, regardless of what other opinions you may or may not share with the writer. And sometimes it will teach you what you want to avoid. But all of that, and you're going to have a lot of people tell you, oh, I won't read this because of that or that. You know what? I would say be very, very Catholic with a small c in your reading.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, just in terms of choosing your writerly mentors, choosing who you read, I think a lot of science fiction writers would say that Gene Wolfe had influenced them. And almost nobody is Gene Wolfe, right? Gene Wolfe was Gene Wolfe. He wrote like Gene Wolfe, and nobody else writes like Gene Wolfe. But because of what he did, and the way that he did, and the way that he approached questions, he influenced a lot of science fiction writers. So you don't have to write like your mentors to be affected by them. Rob, you want to go ahead and kick it over to your guys? We're anxious to hear what they have to say and to be consumers of their talks.
Great, thank you. There was actually there was a question that asked what we could see as some of the biggest bioscience impact in future development and real world impact, which I think is a perfect lead in to what we've been doing. As I mentioned at the lead into the panel, I teach a class every summer on what I call communicating science. There's a small subtitle to that, which is in a social media world. And more so this year than any other, we are using all of our online tools to our advantage to learn how and to practice communicating science in a way that the general public can look at and hear what it is we as researchers are doing and say, oh, wow, that's actually pretty neat. We didn't know quite what you were doing. We didn't understand quite what you were doing. So I have a class of students from Wake Forest University Graduate School and the Biomedical Graduate Program who have prepared 5-minute talks. We're calling them TED Talks with 2 Ds. And the students are preparing and have prepared. And what I'm going to do is I need to do 2 things. First is I have to stop and restart recording because I'm recording these for the students so that they can actually have family members watch, because all too often our family members have no idea what it is we're actually doing. And so this is a great opportunity for everybody. And the other is, as a class, we'll be looking at these and comparing to the first set of presentations that they did. They did very well, and they've been doing very well developing through the class. So, Sydney, are you ready? First up is going to be Sydney Sutton Hyman. Sydney is in the biomedical science research track, and she is a graduate student who is in her final semester of studies. And Sydney, if you will, if you'll say something, we should get your picture up on screen here.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, there we go.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, how is everybody? How is everybody doing today? I know it's storming, so if it gets a little staticky, please bear with me. I know it's just now it's starting to hit where I am, so yeah.
And if you need me to do anything with slides, just let me know. Otherwise, you go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, I'm about to share now. 1 second. Trying to get the screen up. Okay. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Slideshow. All right. Well, again, hello, everyone, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am Sydney Hyman, current graduate student from Wake Forest University, as he stated. Today, my TED Talk focuses on whether or not garlic can kill cancer. So the cancer that we're focusing primarily on today is breast cancer. For women, breast cancer death rates are higher than those for any other cancer. About 1 in 8 women in the United States, just under 12%, will develop invasive breast cancer. And the breast cancer in and of itself is a very heterogeneous disease, which means that in one case of a patient, you may not see the same symptoms, the same issues as you would see in another patient. So the chart on your left depicts just about how heterogeneous these cancers can be. So there's 5 different known types, and there are several that can be a combination of these. Luminal A, luminal B, basal-like, HER2 enriched, and normal-like. So your luminal A and B cancers are typically focused, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but it's right here. The luminal cells, which kind of in a mammary gland, they line the tubes that connect to the lobes within the gland. So in this picture here, you see these luminal cells in blue. This is typically where the luminal cancer targets. Basal-like focuses on the basilar lamina or the basal lamina of the mammary lobule. So within the gland, the innermost part of it. HER2 enriched is a growth factor receptor, and it promotes cancer cell growth. So when there's a huge amount of HER2 cell markers on a cell, that typically means that it proliferates higher than usual. But today, we are going to focus on basal-like. So an example of that is triple-negative breast cancer, which is down at the bottom. So triple-negative breast cancer is typically associated with poor prognosis, poor relapse-free survival, younger patient age, and can target premenopausal African-American women. So you may ask me, Sid, what does garlic have to do with this? And that would be a good question. I wouldn't know either. Diallyl disulfide is a compound that is found in garlic. So when you open up a bottle of this diallyl disulfide, it can smell literally just like a pizzeria. Garlic, just a strong odor. It's oil soluble, and it's effective at reducing the growth of human tumor cells originating from either the colon, the lung, or the skin. So we were hoping that they could do the same effect within breast cancer. So our question is, can diallyl disulfide or DADS selectively inhibit the growth of basal-like breast cancer? So I'm thinking that if you target a triple-negative breast cancer cell line with diallyl disulfide, it can inhibit the growth of the cancer cells, causing apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. So cells typically program themselves to die when something goes haywire within them. So the purpose is to cause that while causing minimal toxicity or damage to normal cells. So if we can do this, this can be a tremendous chemotherapeutic agent. Mm-hmm. So the methods that we use to target this or to discover this is MTT cell proliferation assay, which is an experiment that uses the color of a sample to determine the proliferation or division rate of a particular cell line. So in this case, a triple-negative breast cancer cell line. We also use trypan blue exclusion, which is a method that is used to monitor cell counts and growth rate. So to conclude, discoveries have been shown that diallyl disulfide could be a promising and safe targeted chemotherapeutic agent for basal-like breast tumors. The compound is dose dependent from what data shows, with a cancer cellular response, which means that it will target the cancer cells while having very little impact on the normal cell line. So the chart below just kind of shows that dose dependence. So as you increase the dosage of diallyl disulfide, you decrease the amount of cancer cells living, essentially. So I would like to thank, and I got a lot of this data from my experience at Winston-Salem State University under this lab of Dr. Stephanie Dance-Barnes. And so any contact information, I will be happy to give that to you. But thank you.
What we're going to do is, if anybody's got a question, Sydney's going to have to go very quick. She's got a family obligation coming up. And what I'd like to do is, after each talk, we could take one or maybe two short questions, but save the rest of them for when all the talks are done. But thank you, Sydney. I like that.
Yeah. Do we know if there's a maximum garlic dose where it becomes less effective?
That's a really good question. A lot of this data is from my experience in undergrad. So that was a year from this point. And I know because of COVID, the lab has been sort of set back. So from my experience, the highest dose was around 100 microliters or so. That's about the highest dose that I personally tested. But I'm sure that there will be a paper coming out soon that will have all of that data in there for you.
Cool, thank you.
Has there been a comparison between synthetically generated DADs and that would be harvested from natural growth?
Not quite. We've used just the organically grown derivative from the garlic, but that would be a very great future direction for the experiments to go. I do like that idea, so I could probably send that along.
How was
Thank
it
you.
delivered? How did you deliver the dose?
We pretty much put the triple negative breast cancer cell line in plates, like let's say a 6-well plate, which has 6 pockets to put cells in, cultured those for a couple of days, and then hit them with the treatment dose of diallyl disulfide. So it would depend on the concentration, 25 microliters, 50 microliters, 75, 100 was the highest dose. And then set those there for a few days, incubated those over time, and then looked and saw how much the cells proliferated or not in order to come up with that data.
Quick question. If a person ingested something like this, would the body's system screw it up before it got to the cells that needed to be killed? Or would it be an injection? Or how would it be treated if it was perfect?
That's a really good question as well. I do know that garlic in and of itself is a chemotherapeutic option for patients to take as just a supplemental, this might help you type of thing. So the mechanisms as to how garlic will be able to be digested and dispersed throughout the body is not known yet, as far as I know. But I would be happy to look into that and give you some more information about that later on.
The reason I asked, my daughter in Greensboro last week just had a double mastectomy for metastatic cancer, breast cancer.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Pardon? It was my daughter in Greensboro.
Yes.
Oh,
Double mastectomy, last week.
Yeah. That's always hard.
Yeah.
all right. Let's go ahead. Thank you, Sydney.
Thank you so much.
Say hi to your grandmother for all of us.
I will. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. So coming up next is Zihao Zhao, and he is going to talk to us. Z, are you online? Yes, here he comes. Great.
Yes.
Z is a PhD student in the neuroscience program. You are third year, is that correct?
Actually, fourth now.
No, we won't talk about that. We won't talk about that. All right. So I'm going to turn this over to you for your talk.
Okay, let me share the screen. Can you see the PowerPoint I shared?
Yes, we've got it.
Okay, good. I'm going to start. So first, hello everyone, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm Z, a fourth year neuroscience PhD student at Wake Forest. So our lab studies how the brain processes information in sensory cortices. But today, my topic is the big picture of brain development, about the network dynamics in the developing cortex. So since the first guy considered the brain to be the place where the mind was located about 2,500 years ago, people have put plenty of work on figuring out how brain works, how to explain the functions the brain has. It's like deciphering a computer, a super flash computer, which can be very, very difficult. But if we can understand how the brain develops, how it grows from a group of cells into a group of cells with functions, then we may not be far from the answer. Now you're looking at the lifetime of a human brain. I believe we are most familiar with the last 4 stages, from about to be born to adulthood, which takes years. We may not see how our brain develops, but we can definitely feel how it grows, how our brain gradually gets used to our body. Well, in rodents, because their lives are short, we can observe the whole process in 3 weeks. Here, E18 means 3 days before birth, and P21 means 21 days after birth. There are some really obvious changes from left to right. The brain gets bigger, heavier, and darker. Those changes are caused by the increasing cell number and connections between cells. And these changes look pretty gradual. Indeed, if we look at the number change of some type of cell, like pyramidal cell, and connections between neurons, here is the inhibitory synapse as an example, the development curves are smooth. So this suggests that our brain develops in a gradual way. But what about functions? Sensory functions in specific. We have smell, hearing, sight, taste, and touch, which are controlled by a different part of brain. And we have these senses functionally working even before birth. But in rat, they cannot see or hear in the first 2 weeks of life. So this leads to an interesting question. On the day that they start to see or hear, what happened in the brain? This is a pretty crucial issue because we already know that brain develops in a gradual way, which means that there's no significant change before and after opening the eyes or something. Then what makes the brain from no function to function? The first hypothesis is a gradual model, like what we saw before. Mature level represents functional state where they can see or hear. For a specific function, we usually use some brain activity to represent the development state, such as neuron firing rate or voltage change like EEG. According to this model, then every activity just gradually develops until they can see or hear, like what we saw in the cell level. I have to say, it looks easy, but also really disappointing because we cannot see any exciting and meaningful changes in brain between no function and function. So here is another model, which has an abrupt change before reaching the functional level. In that case, if we compare the brain activity before and after eyes opening, we might see a jump in development curve from no function to function, like a switch. Here, eyes opening is just a superficial event. The real cool stuff is how this abrupt development is generated. One example is in olfactory system, which is smelling. We know there is a oscillatory activity in olfactory cortex at 20 to 30 Hz in adults. This activity can represent the development state of the cortex. So the frequency in the young pups is low and can increase to adult range with age. We can see that there's a breakpoint at P15 where the slope sharply increased. So this is a good example of the abrupt model and suggests that our brain doesn't always develop in a smooth way, sometimes with a sudden change. I believe the brain activity before and after the switch may contain the key to the question I mentioned at the beginning, how brain works functionally. Thank you very much. That's my talk. So any questions?
Thank you,
Well,
Z. Go ahead, panelists.
Well, before questions, congratulations on your graphics. Those were outstanding.
I agree.
Thank you.
And that's an important part of communicating.
Yeah.
So
You ain't
Sure,
seen nothing
yeah.
yet.
Well, I mean that's a big topic, right? It's a big question, and you approach the question by asking some very specific, smaller questions, and I thought that was a neat way to go about it. So, not a question, more a comment. As you go to more and more conferences, you'll realize that most of the people who stand up and raise their hand and ask questions won't be asking questions. So.
On a human example of the same thing, when my children were growing up, educators were saying that there was little point in trying to teach children certain things involving either math or language too early because their mental structures were not ready to master it. If they did master it, it was more a repeating back to me what I was saying rather than actually learning. Is this another example of the phenomena you're talking about?
Yes, exactly. Actually, before it gets mature or before it gets mature, the cortex is always getting ready to receive the information. So that's what we see there before the eyes opening. Actually, the cortex is preparing for receiving the visual. input. After P15, then the cortex is ready. Then they open their eyes and can see everything.
It makes me think of, I'm trying to extrapolate this, the whole singularity, the technological singularity, where artificial intelligence and self-awareness, and where does this whole business of when we become more than just the sum of our parts and become self-aware, right? And you could almost see how you could take this research and have an analog into what you showed at the beginning with computers. Is if and when the singularity occurs, is it going to be broached gradually or just some kind of nonlinear exposition to get there? So,
Les, you've got AIs on the brain.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Z. Thank you very much. Excellent.
That was very
Thank
good.
you.
And we should have some more chance. Audience out there, if you have some questions, put them in the comments and we'll try to incorporate those when we get to the end of the presentations as well. So Jada. Give Jada a moment. Okay, very good. So Jada Powell is currently a second-year master's student in biomedical science research program, and she is working. I'll let you actually explain who you've been working with when you go through acknowledgments and like. So let's. I'll let you jump in.
All righty. Yep, and thank you guys for allowing me to present today. All right, just keeping right in line with Z and our brain discussion. My talk today is on dementia, what your genes have to say about your risk. And dementia, as you may know, is a life-threatening degenerative disease that breaks down the cells in your brain, can lead to loss of memory, loss of executive function. And what we really want to do is examine our genetic structures, which may reveal a person's likelihood of acquiring this disease. So what your genes can tell about your risk. Well, to begin with, our genes are like one great big puzzle. And over the years, as we've tried to complete this puzzle, we find that we keep adding on more and more puzzle pieces. So what may have started out as a 100-piece puzzle set has grown to a 1,000-piece puzzle set. And now it appears that we're looking at a 1 billion-piece puzzle set. We're constantly trying to finish and complete this. But the more we add on to this, with the exploration of our genes and the roles they play, the deeper we come. With any genetic research, the first hurdle that you want to do is finding your piece of the puzzle, so to speak. And that's really just finding your specific genetic component with which to lead your research with. In the case of this research, we're looking for the susceptibility of dementia among diabetic patients. The second hurdle for this research is a really big issue that we have. It's very crucial to our public health system, and that is the issue of racial disparity. We've designed the study in such a way that we will not only address the hypothesis, but also acknowledge any ethnic and cultural discrepancies that may come along with it as well. So where are we making a connection? So we're looking specifically at two diseases, and that's diabetes and dementia. So to begin, this graphic here looks a little bit intense, and normally with a research talk of this manner, I would present something like that. But for this talk, we're not going to deal with that. But basically what the graphic of that manner just says is that our genes code for all of our biological processes, from what we eat, what we think, and how we sleep. And the process that we're most concerned with in this research is metabolomics, and that is the study of how tiny pieces in our genes coded for, called metabolites, function in our body. And so they control, regulate our energy, but they also have a function with our brain excitability and just overall brain function. And these entities can also give further insight to any connection of these two diseases. So the primary goal is that we investigate certain areas on a gene, certain locations, which we call markers, in diabetic patients that can determine a link between cognitive decline and diabetes. And our goal with the design of our study is to test the same hypothesis for two different ethnic groups, European Americans and African Americans. So we perform the same processes, we ask the same questions. As you can see on my slide, I have the same questions going alongside. But this just may not mean that we might not necessarily get the same answers. So how do we get to the point? How do we find these answers? So the first part we want to do is, do we have a clear path to cognitive decline through these genetic markers that we look into? Are these markers provoked by type 2 diabetes? That would also insinuate a connection between the two. And finally, do these markers contribute to the differences or similarities of cognitive decline between European Americans and African Americans with type 2 diabetes? So my personal contribution to the research is I analyzed data from new genes of interest, which we call candidate genes. And we look for clues that may contribute to any of our linkages, like linking two puzzle pieces together. And the chart that is shown here is just one of the tools that we use to review data. And so for this research specifically, I am looking at a specific gene called TREM2. And I'm looking at areas of high genetic variability, what we call recombination hotspots, which are denoted by these long blue areas. So we're looking for the ones with the highest recombination area, which, as you can see, is this one here that I'm pointing to. And so we just use those to maybe like hone in on a specific gene location that may lead to beneficial markers. So finally, what this can tell us? Well, it can answer the question of, does our ethnicity really impact our risk of diseases like diabetes and cognitive decline? It can also help with first stage warning signs of dementia, since we are looking at a pathological indication. So we can also be, this can lead to help improve diagnosis and prognosis and treatment. And overall, we're looking to find and complete our piece of the puzzle. Thank you guys very much for having me today. And just to acknowledge, I am working with my professor, my PI. Her name is Dr. Nicolette Allred, and the title of our study is called Metabolomics of Cognitive Risk of Dementia. Thank you.
Great.
Yes. I have to say that that presentation had particular interest to me because my grandmother suffered from dementia. And my mom had Parkinson's. Not Parkinson's. See, I'm having cognitive problems here.
Is it Alzheimer's? Or?
Alzheimer's, yes.
Yeah,
thank you.
And they kind of go hand in hand. Yeah.
Yes. So I was, like I say, I was particularly interested in what you had to say. Have you been able to reach any preliminary conclusions at this point, or are you still in the data gathering stage?
So this grant or this study, the grant was just funded March of last year. So we are very much so in the beginning stages. And so we hope to at least have conclusive data by year 3. So, but of course with COVID, everything is kind of like in the air. So maybe year 3 or year 4. Yeah. But yeah, we don't have any conclusive data yet.
I sort of suspected that you wouldn't, but
yeah.
Like I say, this one really got my attention and it was presented very well.
Thank you.
Just as a comment too, you're a very dynamic speaker. So even when you had the highly technical slides, I was drawn to actually watching you because you're able to get the enthusiasm in your voice, and you have good use of hands, and so when you're presenting, make sure that they don't turn the spotlight off of you.
Thank you.
It's human communication, right?
Absolutely. That's our first form of communication, definitely.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd like to bring out another positive of the presentation too, is you knew your audience. And you didn't immediately go to the really deep technical that you would in a professional conference, and you took it to a level that we could understand.
And you were tactful about it.
And you were very tactful. That is a very nice tool that you've developed, and kudos. It's good.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions?
I think you nailed it.
Okay, sir. There is a question.
Wait.
If I started asking questions, I don't know if I'd stop.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is definitely a subject where we could go on and on. Not brief.
I'm actually going to bring in one that came up from the audience, which was to say, does access to healthcare limit research potential and test groups in terms of population numbers? I mean, you are doing health disparities research.
Right. So that's really something that we want to define. So right now we're looking at something, a lot of the social determinant factors that may have implications into like our data in the research. So we want to look at probably like where somebody lived, where they grew up, how long they've lived in a community. We're looking at neighborhood cohesion, things of that, like kinship care, things of that manner. We want to really kind of do a more in-depth look. And that's more so what's going into that'll be more so in our results. So when we get further down and actually gain some conclusive data, that's when we want to start intercepting these social determinant factors. But yeah.
And I'll put an editorial comment in, which is that most of what we consider the norms in medicine were measurements taken on white, male, medical students in their late 20s, not quite 30 years of age, who smoked a lot, drank too much coffee, had the wrong kind of diet in the 50s and 60s. So getting the right populations is very important.
Definitely. Absolutely.
Are you also looking at this in terms of the basket? I know that the thinking on diabetes has moved more towards the autoimmune family of diseases. So associations with Hashimoto's or eczema or any asthma, any of those things. Is that part of the framework?
Yes, and so that's actually one of part of our aims. There are actually 3 major aims, and so the second aim, I believe, is the one where we interpret any other genetic predispositions that may be included into a person's physiology, which may account for like an increased, I'll say, predisposition for, say, dementia or cognitive decline. In that case, we want to be very specific, because a lot of our participants are not diagnosed with dementia, but they have all the beginning stages or signs of cognitive decline, which typically will lead into dementia. But yes.
The only thing I would offer is to be aware of potentially geographical differences.
Yeah.
Simply as simple as the water that's being drained. That or anything, just be aware that those can also be factors that you'll have to consider in your data gathering.
Right, and I actually, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I actually was gaining some insight from a professor at Chapel Hill recently, and we were talking about the impact of using zip codes. So looking at a person's zip code. So if I'm able to get into that data, we may have to revisit a lot of our patients, because there are over 700 patients that we're reviewing genetic data for. But my goal is to get as many, or revisit as many participants as we can, to get valuable data on their geographical impact that they may have had in their.
One of the reasons I mentioned that is there was at least one study that found out that inadvertently the fluoridation of water had an impact, and they didn't even consider that originally.
Yeah, and I know that there have been some studies that look at industrial waste, so people that live near more industrial sites, and how that's had an effect on their medical history.
Also altitude, because there's that old saying, live high, train low. And it's kind of interesting. It would be interesting to see, particularly if you had demographically essentially identical groups and you saw a distinction based on that alone.
Yeah, that would definitely be eye-opening.
All right. Thanks, Jada. Excellent
Thank you
job.
again, guys.
All right. We're going to move on. Samaya, are you ready?
I am here.
Okay, this is Samaya Rahim. She is a second-year master's student in biomedical science, and she is also working on a cancer-related topic. So, Samaya, I'm going to turn that over to you.
Is this coming through okay for everyone?
Yes.
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 Great. Thank you all for having me today, and bear with me, I'm soft-spoken, so if you can't hear me at any point, just let me know. So today we'll be talking about studying fatigue. Often when we think of cancer patients, we imagine them receiving chemotherapy, which then leads to an increased exhaustion and lethargy and an overall decreased quality of life. these symptoms are classified as fatigue. And so what is fatigue? Fatigue is a vague feeling of being tired, weak, or exhausted. And it's often a symptom of cancer when it's first diagnosed, but in our case, it's important that we're studying that it's a side effect of cancer treatment. Now, before we get into fatigue, let's talk about the treatment options. When a man is diagnosed with prostate cancer, he will be treated in one of three ways: surgery to remove the tumor, radiation to kill the cancer cells, and active surveillance if it hasn't progressed far enough yet. And despite the fact that radiation is killing the cancer cells and it is beneficial for the patient, there are an increased risk for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, sexual health dysfunction, depression, cognitive and mood dysfunction. And for us, it's important that we note that there is a shown increase in fatigue after radiation therapy. So I bet you're wondering why prostate cancer, why this specific cancer, and why not look at something else? And this is the reason why. According to the Cancer Journal for Clinicians, prostate cancer is the #1 diagnosed cancer in men in the United States. It affects 1 in 7 men, but if detected early, it is very treatable. So that means that 1 in 7 men are being treated for their prostate cancer, but they're coming out on the other side with a decreased quality of life. So the goal of our study is to understand what is causing the fatigue and what the behind the scenes mechanisms of what is really going on here. So for the first part of our study, we wanted to develop a model to understand how we can define fatigue. So what you're seeing here is cages that we used for our mice for our study. We developed a model of measuring radiation-induced fatigue in our mice. The mice are placed in these cages with the running wheels, which you're seeing in the middle. These are then connected to a counter, which measure overall activity, and these give us data that looks like this. So what we're looking at here is a comparison of irradiated mice versus sham, which just means that they're not receiving the irradiation, but they're going through the experimental conditions. When we look at the graph, we can see that the activity significantly drops for the irradiated mice, that you're seeing the one in red right here, and the sham does not. It's important to note that before irradiation, they have the same level of activity. So now we move to try to understand why this is happening, what is actually going on inside the body, that radiation is causing this symptoms. So we use a series of techniques such as Western blotting on the left and a fancy machine known as the seahorse on the right, not an actual seahorse. And it gives us data that looks like this. The GLUT4 and TFAM are proteins of interest. They are essential for metabolic function and respiration. So from our study, we can see that on the left, GLUT4 and TFAM have a decreased presence right here with the irradiated mice. And on the right, you can see that the black bars are the irradiated mice versus the white are the non-irradiated, and you can see a significant decrease. So what does all this mean? Basically, we all know mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. GLUT4 and TFAM are 2 essential proteins for metabolic function and respiration. And based on these studies, we can see that irradiation is causing them to decrease, which is then leading to fatigue symptoms in our patients. So these are 2 studies where we published our data in scientific reports and International Journal of Molecular Medicine. If anyone is interested in reading in more detail about ongoing studies, I'll be happy to share that with you. There are further studies needed to investigate the effects of irradiation, which will allow patients and doctors to understand the mechanism to create better chemotherapy, irradiation, and manage symptoms more efficiently so that there isn't this decreased quality of life in prostate cancer patients. And there you have it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samaya. Questions for her?
Go ahead, Dave.
Go. Okay. I was just going to ask, is there any evidence, any look at the possibility of supplementing these areas to compensate for what the radiation therapy is doing? Is there a technique that might accomplish that?
So that's a really good question. There are a few studies. There's a preliminary study looking at ketamine, but because there are a lot of side effects, it's still very preliminary in the clinical trials. And then there's also another study going on looking at the effects of exercise before, during, and after. And that has been promising with the results. There is still an overall decrease in quality of life activity, I guess you could say, but it does help to exercise.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess my question was going to be more of a question of for the chemotherapy. Now, this is just my ignorance on the topic. So it sounds like fatigue would be more of a system-wide problem. Is the chemo targeted for the specific cancer in a specific part of the body, or is it do that, but it's still administered systemically and has a systemic effect?
That's actually a really good question. This is a localized treatment, so it's specific to the prostate. There are two methods. One is they're called metallic beads that are then inserted surgically, so they stay within that region. And then the other is an actual machine that they irradiate.
Right. So this is radiation, not chemo.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is focused just on radiation. I apologize.
But the fatigue effect is systemic. It involves the whole person. Okay.
And so the lowered or TFAM and GLUT4 is systemic as well.
Yeah, that's systemic.
Wow.
The nuclear.
What exactly is GLUT4?
It's involved in glucose transport. So
is
when
it
we talk about,
glutathione or what is it?
I'm sorry?
Is it glutathione or what is it?
I'm not actually sure. I don't know what we always just refer to it as a GLUT4. I can look into that though.
Yeah, the actual issue is the fact that most of these proteins only ever go by their abbreviations, and not by a longer name.
Yeah.
I must say that I have some professional knowledge of whole body radiation and its effects and penetrating radiation. I will be very interested to hear how a localized treatment can create systemic effects like this. So anything you can produce along those lines will be an extraordinarily advance in the field.
I would love to give more information on that as we continue our studies.
Yeah, I mean, if you find anything, would you seek me out and tell me?
Absolutely, of course, I would love to.
Okay. Any other questions, or did you want to just toss something in there? I was
going to ask if there's more questions.
Okay. All right.
Thank
you, Samaya. Appreciate
that. Was fascinating.
Very.
Okay.
You got my attention.
So Brent came up and says, I'm sorry, Hannah said, glucose transporter 4 is GLUT4. Okay. Thank you. All right. So next up is Hannah Carlson. Hannah is just starting her 3rd year in the neuroscience PhD program. She's actually came to us from the master's program and converted over to the PhD. And she's our Lord of the Rings fan of the class. She actually, she got her master's in psychology before coming in, which is to say that, by the way, there's an awful lot of hard scientists studying psychology out there. So I'll just toss in that plug as well. All right, Hannah, if you would take off.
Yep. All right. Let me know if you can see my screen here.
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Well, hi, everyone. And thanks for making time to be here today. So I study alcohol use disorder, and specifically I'm interested in changes in the brain that either lead to or result from alcohol use. So I'm going to explain an area of behavior that's become particularly interesting to me recently, as well as the model that my lab is using to study it. Now, I probably don't have to tell you that alcohol use is extremely common. About 86.3% of Americans have reported using alcohol, as well as 400,000 adolescents. And one of the reasons is that alcohol is one of the few legal substances but it's also ingrained in our culture as a social practice. So when you think about 21st birthdays, champagne on New Year's Eve, my boyfriend having a beer in the other room because it's past 5 o'clock, this becomes clear. And although not everyone who consumes alcohol is going to develop a problem, the prevalence of alcohol use in this country means that there's a large risk for abuse nonetheless. In the United States, 14.4 million people meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder, or AUD, and of these, fewer than 8% receive treatment. So what's clear from these statistics is that alcohol is a huge public health issue, and it's actually been declared the 3rd leading cause of preventable death worldwide. But often our familiarity with it keeps us from thinking about alcohol like we do other drugs of abuse, because in truth, AUD is an addiction. So before we go any further, I want to clarify what I mean by addiction. And I shouldn't have to say this, but first of all, addiction in general is not a personal failing or a weakness. Decades of research have indicated that it is a brain disease. And we really need to take this into account when we think about developing treatments. Next off, it's a chronic and relapsing disease, which means that addiction involves permanent changes and can recur even after treatment, but it is also treatable. So it's crucial that we just study how it develops, who is at risk, and how relapse occurs, just like we would for any other disease. Now, finally, addiction is characterized by specific neural changes. So it erodes the circuits that control our ability to process reward, stress, and self-control. Let's dig into that a little bit.
Okay, Hannah, your slides are not advancing on screen.
Really? No. I don't know what to do. What do I do?
Well, there's one way to do this, and let me see if I can pop in.
Can you see them now?
No, as a matter of fact, unfortunately, we did not advance past your critical point.
Well,
hang on, swapping presenter and view. And now let's see if I can get.
Oh, of course, that's what gets stuck up there.
Yes.
Addiction is not a personal problem.
By the way, this happens all the time in every technical meeting I've ever been to.
So you're getting good experience and learning to cope with it now.
You know, it just really figures that that's what it would get stuck on.
Turn off your screen share, and I will turn on mine. Okay, now.
Roll a 2D at 2.
That would be appropriate for Hannah.
Yeah, this is a crit fail if ever I saw one.
I think you can blame big alcohol in this.
So you were saying it's not a personal problem.
Not a personal problem. Brain disease. Decades of research indicate this. And we need to take this into account. We need to treat it like a disease. So it's also a chronic and relapsing disease, but it is treatable. And then finally, it's characterized by changes in neural circuits, including reward, stress, and self-control, that I'm going to dig into a little bit more right now. So circuits are composed of connections between brain regions, which are bundles of related neurons or brain cells. And prolonged alcohol use disrupts the normal activity of these parts of the brain. And this disruption manifests behaviorally when we look at the symptoms of AUD. So symptoms associated with reward can include intoxication, that drunken, giddy, euphoric feeling. But this also contributes to tolerance, where it takes you more and more alcohol to get that same good feeling over time. Symptoms associated with stress can include drinking to relieve stress, but also the anxiety and agitation that comes when someone is addicted to alcohol and is unable to get it, so during withdrawal. And then finally, self-control. And this manifests in drinking more frequently or in larger amounts than intended, but also in drinking despite negative consequences on career or personal or social life. Now, what I'm particularly interested in is self-control. So what's dually important about the role of self-control, or in psych terms, inhibitory control, is that a lack of self-control can be both a risk factor. So people who demonstrate more impulsivity are more likely to engage in risky drinking, but it's also a symptom of alcohol use. So alcohol can lower our inhibitions. which means that self-control circuit in the brain is of critical importance both when we're considering prevention for and treatment of AUD. I got a couple more slide advancements there.
Okay. And are you ready for the next?
Yes.
All right, there we go.
So how do we study this? Because we certainly can't go poking around in people's brains. So instead, we develop what we call translational models. And this means models for behavior in animals from which we can use results to make hypotheses about a human condition. So what I'm showing you here is the behavioral inhibition model I've been working on developing for my own studies. Now, in this model, the rodent is placed inside a chamber, and they are taught that when a light goes on, a sipper tube with alcohol will appear for 20 seconds. They are free to drink it to their heart's content. Now, once they learn this association, which is analogous to a lit bar sign, right? It signals alcohol availability. We add a consequence cue, and these are called our shock trials. So during the shock trial, the consequence cue is an auditory tone. And this tone sounds for the first half of those 20 seconds when the sipper tube is out. And now if the rodent decides to drink while the tone is sounding, they receive a low-level shock. And this is acting as our negative consequence. So it's not enough to hurt them, but it is enough that they want to avoid it. So what this looks like is them realizing that if they wait for the tone to end, they can still drink for 10 seconds without punishment. And when they do this, it requires a level of inhibitory control. So what we're simulating here is a decision about when it's appropriate or inappropriate to consume alcohol based on the consequences. And for the rodent, this consequence is an unpleasant shock, but for a human, these consequences could include long-term health problems, failure to fulfill work or personal or social duties. Now, we can use this model in two ways. So we can use it as a predictive model to help us discern what kinds of personal or environmental factors, like childhood stress, might contribute to or engender risk for developing an alcohol use disorder. And this ultimately leads to developing early interventions or prevention to keep people from developing alcohol use disorder in the first place. But we can also use it as a disease model. So to model the symptoms of AUD and then look for treatments for those. And this is why translational models are so incredibly important, because they allow us to control these necessary variables to make conclusions that have a real impact on human health and wellness. And that's all, folks. Thanks for bearing with me.
There we go. Thank you, Hannah. And thank you for bearing with the switch over. This is, in fact, why I asked all the students, I said, make sure you send me a copy of it, because if something goes wrong, we can fix it.
Whoever posted the +5 resilience was right. This was another one that had a lot of personal reverberation with me, because my wife's father was a very physically abusive alcoholic. And one of the things that you were talking about mirrors exactly what her mother talked about, which was the progressive degeneration of self-control in him because of the drinking. So I think if you can come up with a predictive model to help deal with that, good on you. Okay. This is an area that just has incredible long-term generational consequences.
Just out of curiosity, I saw you had a picture of the child doing the marshmallow test, which I've read about in psychology. Yeah. I guess I was going to ask, have they done any long-term studies to know about the propensity of children that had self-control at those ages? I mean, is it explicitly called out about these kinds of behaviors later in life that that's very clearly known?
There are some. The issue is that a lot of those tests are confounded by different factors, so other things that children experience. By and large, people who demonstrate more trait impulsivity do tend to engage in risky behavior, and that will make them more likely to develop different types of substance use disorders.
However, two comments. One is that's a very clever experiment. And I would suggest that you start thinking of a second experiment that is analogous to it, but doesn't use exactly the same protocol, just so you don't get it a single data source that might or might not be as resilient to other investigations. And since we're all in science fiction as well, I believe Robert Heinlein wrote a short story. I think it goes, is it Johnny Was a Man? Where they're trying to test whether a chimpanzee or an ape is sentient, gets legal rights as a sentient being. And one of the things that the person does is he says, as a test in court to the ape, he says, I'll give you this amount of money or this many bananas or this many something if you'll say this right now. And the guys and the subject says, no, I won't, because it's wrong. But only afterwards does he tell the other people, after the case is over, that he told them that if he went along with it, he'd give him 3 times as much after the court was over.
Call that delayed gratification.
Yeah.
Same as your test.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to jump in here real quick. Dr. Gannon needs to leave us now, and I wanted to thank you, Chuck, for joining us today, and your input and your feedback has been invaluable, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That sounds like a really promising and extremely important study.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks,
Bye,
Hannah.
Hi, Chuck.
Okay, next up is Naomi Bean. And Naomi is a third-year PhD student in neurobiology and anatomy in the neuroscience program. And I've had a fair amount of interaction with the research that Naomi is working on, because I was dissertation committee chair for somebody in her laboratory. We ran through that about a year ago, and so when her research came up, I go, oh yeah, I know that stuff. That looks good. So I will also advise all of our watchers and listeners right now that she has the most difficult pronunciation job of any of the students. So Naomi, it's all yours.
Perfect. Okay, let me get this up here. And let me go ahead and start it, hopefully. Okay, does everybody see that?
Very good.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Hampson. I study a specific form of blindness called hemianopia. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is and what our lab is doing to try to reverse it. So in order to understand hemianopia, we have to have a basic understanding of how visual information is separated in the brain. Of course, we all know vision starts at the eye, and we know that each eye gets information from both the left side of visual space as well as the right side of visual space. Now, it's here in the eye, the visual information is transformed into an electrical signal and sent into the brain via the optic nerve. The first stop for this information is the lateral geniculate body, but you can see from our diagram that information is already separated at this point. A partial crossing at the optic chiasm results in right side visual space being represented on the left side of the brain and left side visual space being represented on the right side of the brain. Now from here, information is sent to the visual cortex, and we typically think about this as the first stop for visual processing. And this is where our lab is interested. We're interested in individuals who have specific damage to one side or hemisphere of visual cortex. This results in a specific type of hemianopia or blindness called hemianopia. Because one side of the brain is affected, one side of visual space is affected. And we usually represent this as a black box. But it's important to know that our patients are experiencing a reduction of the visual field with a bias towards one side or the other. So they may not even realize that they have a visual deficit. You can see from these examples that this creates a very frustrating and potentially dangerous environment as they try to navigate their lives. There are many causes of hemianopia. 11% of our patients present with hemianopia due to tumor, 14% due to TBI or traumatic brain injury, but most patients present with hemianopia from stroke. Now this is of note because we know that the life expectancy of the general population is increasing. And we also know that prevalence or probability of experiencing a stroke increases with age. And so taken together, we can anticipate an older population with higher numbers of stroke and higher numbers of hemianopia. So what can we do to help? On this diagram, you can see the primary visual pathway that I went through before, the eye, the lateral geniculate body, and the cortex. But luckily, we all have a secondary or subcortical visual pathway. Now, again, of course, this starts at the eye. And visual information is sent deep into the brain at the superior colliculus, specifically the superficial layers. From here, visual information goes to a structure called the pulvinar, and then on to our good friend, the cortex. Now, it's of note that even under hemianopia, visual information is still being processed in the brain at these structures. So why can't our patients see? We think it's the final step in this pathway. We'll go back to the superior colliculus, but to the deep layers. Under hemianopia, the cells here no longer respond to visual cues. So we think this is where the problem is. Now, our lab has a long history with the superior colliculus, but generally we study it as a multisensory integrative structure. What does that mean? Well, it means that when I play an auditory cue at a certain location in space, cells in the deep layers of the superior colliculus will respond. If I play a visual cue in the same area of space, the same cells will respond as well. And when I play an auditory cue and a visual cue in the same time, the same space, those cells go crazy. So we're hoping to be able to sort of hijack this computational transform, if you will, or this integration, in order to sensitize the cells and have them respond again to visual-only sensory stimuli. Now, we know that by presenting a multisensory cue, the cells will respond, presumably to the auditory component. But with repeated exposures, we can present the visual cue and get responses from the cells by itself. Pretty cool, if I do say so myself. We also have behavioral evidence for this as well. So again, of course, we know an individual with no damage is able to respond to visual cues across the left and right sides of space. An individual with hemianopia, cortical damage, is no longer able to respond to one side, and so here we show that as the left side of space. But after about 4 weeks with our multisensory training paradigm, we see that individuals with cortical damage are once again able to respond to those cues behaviorally, which again, is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Now, my portion of the research is looking at specific outcomes. So my questions are, what are the visual capabilities of these rehabilitated individuals? Can they differentiate shapes, colors, spatial frequencies, and motion? And what part of the brain is now taking over these reinstated capabilities? Is it the superior colliculus? Is the cortex getting on board? Is it the pulvinar? Or is it some other visual structure that we haven't listed and are unaware of? So I just thank you for the opportunity to present. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Naomi. I'm going to lead with a question because I think this is one that folks are actually going to be interested in.
Okay.
When you see the rehabilitation, I know you're working with an animal model, but if a person were to be rehabilitated in this manner, would they be able to tell you that they can see it? Or are we looking at things like other evidence, eyes being able to track, turning the head, or making a response that may not necessarily be conscious?
So that is, of course, the big literal $1 million grant question, right? So, there are therapies for hemianopia now, and there is a lot of dispute over what that is really accomplishing. And like you mentioned, some evidence would indicate that instead of being able to see on that side of space again, we're just training people to scan their environment more. So more oculomotor use and just looking to that area. Again, as you mentioned, we do use an animal model, and we're hoping to get at that question with those tasks. So we're going to present a variety of visual tasks before and after hemianopia to see, can those recovered individuals do the same tasks at the same level, and can they learn new visual tasks? So I'm not sure if that answered your question, because I feel like that's really what we're trying to get at with this phase of the study.
Great. Any other questions?
And I'm so sorry, real quick, because I can talk about this forever, but the human aspect of it is even more complicated. So we're trying to get at the basics of how these circuits work and the science behind it, and of course the clinical applications. One of the struggles we have with human populations is that they don't have the same cortical damage. They don't present with the same damage, either by route of damage or area of damage. And so we can get inconsistent results. We know that individuals who have spared cortex, that cortex is amazing, and it's able to take over some of the capabilities that the damaged cortex was previously responsible for. So that kind of makes our job a little harder when we're trying to look at what this subcortical pathway can do for rehabilitation.
In when one of my children was young, he suffered an injury that had the effect, the doctor said, of beginning to turn off one eye. He was very young. He was about 7 or 8. And they patched his good eye. And they forced his brain to continue to process and to learn to reprocess the information after the physical damage had been recovered. Can you use a similar way to check whether the bad eye is sending the signals or not?
So I love this question. And again, please stop me because I could talk forever. But what you just described, I don't know if it's the same mechanism, and I'm not sure, what underlying condition your son had. So it's hard to compare. But all those disclaimers out there, all those asterisks aside, the reason that we know or think we can accomplish this is actually from a study in the 60s. So visual neuroscience has a very long history. And there was a man studying hemianopia in an animal model. And so he was creating these conditions of hemianopia and trying to see what other brain structures contribute to that blindness. And he destroyed another area. And instead of seeing more blindness or more pervasive blindness, he actually saw a recovery. And so the underlying thought behind all of this is that there's a balance of inhibition and excitation in the brain. And by destroying cortical tissue, we, I don't want to say enhance because that's confusing. The inhibition is no longer checked, if that makes sense. There's an increase in inhibition on this subcortical system. And so what we're trying to do is strengthen inputs into that inhibited side, if you will. And I would equate that to sort of what your experience or what your son experienced, that you're sort of forcing this other side to work harder to compensate.
So you're shutting down one channel to force the water into the other channel.
So for us, yes, I mean, for us, what we are looking to do is strengthen inputs. We think that the side that is being affected by the damage is being overwhelmed by this inhibition. And so if we can strengthen the inputs from, we think, cortical areas, then we can get those deep layer cells to respond again.
That's cool.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
But I'm also really biased. So.
Yeah, well, I can tell. I don't know anybody else who could talk and talk and talk. Look at Rob. Okay.
Naomi?
Well, I want to comment that you did an excellent job explaining the problem.
Thank you.
Explaining what a possible remediation is and an experiment to study it. And so as far as a communication of what you're doing, why it's important, and your path forward, I think you did a great job.
I agree.
Thank you very much. I appreciate
agree
that.
Also.
Thank you.
I agree.
Thank you, Naomi. And of course, you're very enthusiastic about it as well.
And that always helps. That always helps in one of these things. I'm absolutely dead serious. If you have somebody who is showing a lot of enthusiasm for a subject, that's going to really help, because people are going to be more interested in trying to grasp what you're communicating because of your obvious interest.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great.
All right. So we are going to move on to Hope Peterson. Hope is a third-year PhD student in the neuroscience program at Wake Forest Medical School, Wake Forest Medical Center. She earned her bachelor's and master's degree, which makes her a triple deacon. And she's was conducting psychophysiology research for those degrees. And now she works with a little bit more imaging emphasis. Hope, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Hampson. Let's see, can everybody see this?
And it is, there we go. Yes, it's up.
Awesome. Let me get it in presentation mode. All right, well, thank you all so much for sticking with us this far. I know you've heard a lot of talks on a lot of very different topics. So thank you for sticking with us and still being here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the functional connection between the brain and the body and how studying these systems together can help us change the way that we study neuroscience. And specifically, I look at the connection between these systems when studying risky drinkers. So historically, neuroscientists have studied the brain, obviously, And over the past century, we've learned so much about genetics and what certain brain areas do, all of those different regions Naomi was talking about, that we can isolate them. But we still really know next to nothing about how the brain big picture works. Thinking about how these cells communicating with each other become thoughts and feelings and experiences. And I personally think that comes from the fact that neuroscientists typically only look at function above the neck. But in fact, your nervous system is all connected. So your brain is running all of these nerves that connect to and influence every organ and every system in your body. And this entire nervous system works in a seamless, coordinated way all the time. And I think it's important that we study your brain while considering how these other systems are working. That said, the brain is already too complex for us to understand on its own, and looking at the brain and the function of all of these other organ systems is just too daunting of a task. So what I study specifically is I'm looking just at the function of the brain and the function of the cardiac system. And I look specifically at the cardiac system because it's very easy to measure, totally non-invasive, and it's always active. So I know I can always get good data from it. So specifically what I'm measuring in the cardiac system is the time between heartbeats as you inhale and as you exhale. And we know that this specific control of heart rate is maintained by this very specific and very simple brain circuit. And so I measure people's heart rate and breathing rate, and I get data that looks something like this: heart rate in red on the top and breathing in the bottom in blue. And what I actually calculate is how long the time between heartbeats is as you inhale and as you exhale. And when I compare that ratio, I end up with this score shown in purple here that tells me how variable your heart rate is. And I can then include that score in my measures of brain function. Which brings me to how I actually study the brain. I use a big machine called an MRI, which uses a huge magnet to take pictures of the inside of your body. Clinically, like if you were to go into the hospital, MRIs are used to look at the physical structure inside your body. And the physics behind how that works is pretty complicated, but essentially this magnet measures water density in your tissues. So it can show you the difference between skin and bone and different kinds of tissues in your body because they all have different amounts of water. In a research setting, in addition to looking at the structural scans, I also collect what is called functional MRI data, or fMRI. And it uses those same magnetic properties, but it looks at the amount of blood and the amount of oxygen in your blood. So I can use this method to track what areas of your brain are active. Areas that use up oxygen are areas that we think things are going on, and areas where there's more oxygen, we think they're not turned on. So I can use this fMRI measure as a proxy of brain activity when I ask you to do some task. So what I do is I use a combination of this cardiac measure and this brain activity to study people who drink alcohol. My dissertation project specifically is aimed at looking at who will become an alcoholic, like Hannah was talking about, and who can drink every day without a problem. So a huge portion of the US currently drinks alcohol, and a subset of those people, as Hannah described to you, will develop problems with alcohol. That might be an alcohol use disorder, or more colloquially, alcoholism. But that's a small portion of this drinking population that we can see. And so my question is, of all of these other people who are drinking alcohol, who among them might later on develop problems, and who can have a glass of wine with dinner every day for their entire life and be fine? So I do study people who drink quite a bit of alcohol. If you're just drinking a beer on a Saturday watching a football game, you're not super at risk to become alcoholic. Specifically, I look at women who drink at least 7 drinks a week and men who drink at least 14 drinks a week. Those numbers come from the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. Those are what they consider low-risk numbers. So people who study more than, or who drink more than that, rather. And because I want to look specifically at this interaction between alcohol and cardiac measures, I have to be really choosy with who I select for these studies, which is sort of a hallmark for complex biomedical studies, which we do in humans. which is a little unique of the talks that you've heard today. So the way that my study works is after I measure heart rate activity and I calculate that heart rate variability measure, I use fMRI to look at these drinkers' brain activity after they drink normally and after they haven't had any alcohol for a week. And while they're in the MRI, I show them pictures of alcohol to make them crave. And then I'm looking at how those heart rate scores and changes in brain activity are connected when a drinker is craving alcohol after they've had alcohol and after they haven't had alcohol. And this method is pretty novel because not very many neuroscientists study these peripheral measures like heart rate. But I believe that it's really important to get a picture of the whole system if we really want to understand how it works. And I hope other neuroscientists will be influenced in that way in the future. So thank you so much for your attention. I'd like to thank all the members of my lab, and I welcome questions that you have now that are quick. And after we have one more talk, we'll have more time for questions.
I have a pacemaker for a dropped pulse. So I was like, okay, I can get I can get into this one. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
I'm very interested in the idea that there is now a push to pair heart rate variability with different imaging. I know of at least one other project. Is this new, or is this, something we've known about and we just never made the connection?
Kind of both. Everybody knows that the systems are connected, but it's becoming more and more popular in neuroscience to look at these peripheral measures. And this is actually not the only peripheral measure being studied at all, or even that I use in my studies. But it's just because neuroscience is so complex. Like if you think back to Hannah's study with alcohol, imagine how much more complicated her studies would be if she was also measuring the rodent's heart rate and trying to add that into the analysis. So it's typically just not done because it's hard to do, to fit this much data together into an analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Just an observation. I'm fascinated with this whole notion of operating as a system. And I recently, I'm almost finished with a book called Delay. It's about the science of delay. And there was an article, there was a section in there about the marshmallow test, which we saw earlier, and associated heart rate changes on the children who were good at having delayed gratification. And it was directly related to measurements of heart rate when they were taking the marshmallow test. So in my mind, I'm kind of connecting the dots on all this. And I'm just really pleased to hear that this kind of systemic level thinking is happening, because it's like the gut and its effects on other parts of the body and mood and everything else. I can't help but think that the system is a lot more complex and interconnected. And the more data we get like this, the more valuable. You did a great job explaining that. So thank you.
But now you're looking at a ratio, right?
So, yes.
Pairing of factors.
Yes. So the way that it works, when boiled down to the very basics, as you inhale, your heart rate speeds up, and as you exhale, your heart rate slows down. That's part of the balance of your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And you want that difference in heart rate to be really big. If you have a higher variability, that's been linked to all sorts of positive outcomes, higher resilience, higher adaptability, things like that, which goes back to that marshmallow test. If you're seeing greater changes in heart rate in response to these behavioral tasks, that's a good thing.
In your study, will you be able to differentiate between fitness levels and the effects?
Yep. So that's one of the things we control for. We actually, working with human participants takes a very, very long time. I've been collecting data on this study for about 2.5 years. And we start out at the very beginning with about 2.5 hours of questionnaires for these people. So I can control these analyses based on their education level, their family history of alcohol problems, their exercise levels, the amount that they're currently drinking, how frequently they're drinking. I can look at all of that in these results.
Because I know that doctors like to use a stress test, an actual physical stress test on every subject before they go down to this path.
So that's so funny. We actually were just in the beginnings of starting a follow-up to this study, looking at whether we could decrease craving with acute exercise. And so we were taking people with high and low fitness and having them jog on a treadmill for 20 minutes. And with COVID, unfortunately, we haven't been able to get that study up and running, but that's, we think, a really integral part of this function.
Great. Thank you, Hope. I want to move on to our last of our talks. Junda Zhu is a third-year PhD student in the neuroscience program. Y'all will have noticed that there is a definite neuro leaning among the students on this so far. And Junda, if you would take it away.
All right. And can you all see my screen now?
Yes.
Is it presenting correctly? All right. Hey everyone, I'm Junda Zhu, a PhD student in neuroscience at Wake Forest University. I studied self-control in adolescent development for human and primates. Today, I just would like to briefly share my research work and what I'm interested in. So, one typical feature of human behavior is our ability to act flexibly in response to different environments. And for example, while you are walking down a crowded street, you might notice an attractive person in the distance. And an admiring glance towards that person might be fine or even nice under most of the circumstances. Except, however, when you are with your partner. In this instance, it might be wise to avoid looking towards that distance, and instead to orient to the opposite direction. Just look away, right? And this flexibility is a hallmark of executive control, which is a very large part of brain functions, including reasoning, making decisions, and controlling ourselves. And as we know, adolescents are bad at executive control, especially for suppressing the impulses. Teens like to adventure, and scientists have measured how bad they are at making safe choice in lab. They asked the participants from different age groups to do a stoplight test. This behavioral task is very simple. It just simulated the scene that you are driving a vehicle, passing a traffic light, turning from red to yellow to green. No, the opposite, just from green to yellow to red. And you can choose if or when to press the brake to stop your visual car. And not surprisingly, teens choose more to just go across the intersection, not slow down, not even stop. And in another study, scientists put the intelligence and the maturity in scales by combining several tests and questionnaires. Apparently, smart and immature is not a great option. And consider all these social factors like gender or educational background, cultural background, taking part in most of these real life tasks. Neuroscientists turn to measure the eye movement in lab. It is because eye movement is simple and it shares the same basic function with a lot of complicated behaviors we mentioned before. And in our lab, we study the eye movement with non-human primates. We train the subjects to look at the green dot in the center of the screen first, and then look at the opposite direction of the white dot when the green dot disappears. If they do it correctly, they have juice as a reward. It looks easy and simple. The rule is so straightforward, but in practically it's very hard for both human and animals.
Junda, we did not get your screen advance.
Where are you now?
I'm still looking at the intellectual ability versus psychosocial maturity slide.
Are we advancing now?
Nope. Hang on. I can fix. Go ahead and stop your screen share, and I will jump in and take over. This is
the kind of moment you live for, Rob, when you get to jump in and take over.
Yes, of course it is. Let's see, but
I've worked with you.
All right, there we go. And nope, that's green right there. But I can't, nope, that is not showing. Yes, it is showing me the right screen. But it doesn't want to show me the right one. Okay. Okay. Okay, are we seeing the, okay.
Yes.
Okay, Junda, go ahead and reiterate from here.
Okay, yeah. In our lab, we study the eye movements with non-human primates. And we train the subjects to look at the green dot in the center of the screen first, and then look at the opposite direction of the white dot. Can I advance the screen or? Yep. Yeah, and then look at the opposite direction of the white dot when the green dot disappears. And if they do it correctly, they can have juice as reward. And it seems to be very simple and straightforward, but practically it's quite hard for both human and animals. And for the results, we found that the young animals are not as good as adult ones, no matter how much they practiced and how slow they hold their action to think and then go. So what really lead to this? And scientists has already know that there's a important brain area contributing a lot to the executive function, and that is the prefrontal cortex. It locates on the front part of the front lobe, roughly just behind your forehead. And it's an advanced area that only high-level animals, like first mammals and especially for primates, have a fully developed functional one. And we found that brain is not fully matured after we were born for a long time. And in this figure, we can see that the changes of brain in age series from around 5 years old to 30 years old. The blue means less change, and the red means more. And the prefrontal cortex keep changing until mid-20. And this development pattern pervades across species for a lot of mammals. So it leads to the similar behavior pattern for humans and animals. And here we start to think, for this pattern to have endured millions of years of evolution across species, it must confer some benefit. For this, we believe that the experience gained in the adolescence are so critical for survival later in life. So when you ask teens why they ate the tadpole or why they just jump off the dangerous cliff without any protection, it's likely that they just can't help. It's biology. Self-control is hard for young, across species. And now we know that there's a reason for them to be risk-taking. Even their choices and decisions are immature or dangerous or sometimes just silly. I think that's it. I will take questions. Thank you.
Okay, I have to stop.
So
there we go.
So the risk-taking behavior is building your database for later self-control. Your experiential data that tells you really don't want to do that. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Well, my son definitely has stored up a lot of data then.
We all.
But is it experience buildup or is it biological change?
It's actually, we are just want to figure out why this kind of silly and dangerous biological base will endure across the evolution, because we know, okay, it's dangerous for you to try dangerous stuff, but it's kind of like a trade-off, because you need the experience. You need to gain knowledge and experience to explore the world when you are young for your survival later in time. So it just survive. This is a trade-off, and it seems reasonable for you to be a little bit risk-taking or immature.
Is there any indication that as your brain matures, you're better able to profit by someone else's experience by watching a behavior and saying that's a risky one I don't want to repeat, or is that outside your purview right now?
Yeah, for me, I'm not very sure, but yeah, it really sounds reasonable. Like when you are getting matured, it's easy for you to gain knowledge or experience in other way, rather than
This
just
actually,
experience it by yourself.
this plays into my theory of why science fiction is important, right? And why it gets us back to where we are when we're making these risky decisions, right? Is that it's firing those memories for us when we were exploring and pushing boundaries. So.
I never did that.
Right.
Right.
I knew you before you had kids. I'm not buying that.
There's an advantage to having a certain proportion, a certain percentage of your population do something risky, particular if it involves gaining access to a new gene pool. That is, if you have some, let's just say, male specimens within your social group go some significant distance away from where it's safe, they may venture into a new gene pool and hence spread their genes further. So it would seem like there's an evolutionary advantage to some extent to having risk-taking in the young.
I've always figured that there was an evolutionary advantage in it. It's just a pain in the butt for the parents of the young involved.
Well, I don't know if that really works, because if you take a look at where the ages that he's talking about, he's talking prepubescent, not postpubescent. So.
Well, his chart didn't get mature till 25.
Well, that's for that's just for the brain, but for behaviorally, when we talk about adolescents, we are talking about around the human like 9 to 18, I think, just the teenager years. Yeah.
We fight wars of 18-year-olds.
Barbara Tuchman will tell you that it was the 18-year-olds running Europe. She's wrong, but that's what she'll tell you.
I think it's important to interject at this point that the higher primate brain has a function that is not really present in other mammals, which is what we call mirror neurons. And mirror neurons respond when a subject sees another of their same species doing certain acts, doing things. They mirror the behaviors and they mirror the emotions and they mirror the actions. And these are parts of the brain, neurons in the brain, that are specifically tuned to pick up on what others are doing. And so a really neat element of what Junda is researching can come down to perhaps the young do this, and not all of them, but some of them do it so that others can see it.
Yes, we liked Johnny, but Johnny was a bad example. Now and the saber tooth is why. No, I can. That's fascinating. I think that we have become, certainly, I think the lay public has become more aware of the relationships between biology and brain structure and whatnot, and action than we once were. The degree to which there are factors involved beyond simply his parents didn't teach him right or whatever. And I find every peek at that fascinating in its own way.
Thank you, sir.
So you become a science fiction fan at an early age, and that allows you to live your life vicariously and doing dangerous things in other universes and out in space and everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to thank all of the panelists and all of the students. Students, you've been getting feedback from me all along. I have loved the opportunity for you to get feedback from folks outside the class. And I'll give you all a virtual hand of applause there for the presentations, and thank all of my students. I know I've kept you longer than you probably anticipated for a Saturday afternoon, but I also want to thank all of you panelists and Tony and Bain and Christopher. Thank you, Christopher, for setting this up and making this work. And I really appreciate everybody's participation and the viewers who've watched us on Facebook Live. There are questions there that we did not get to because of time. I hope students, you'll go ahead and take a look, and perhaps you may be able to get be able to toss some answers in there. I'll look at some of these and see if we can get some answers as well. But I want to thank everybody.
Speaking for myself, this is something that I'm very glad I spent an afternoon doing.
Well, we appreciate it.
Absolutely, 100% agree.
I agree. I do this more often.
All right. Thank you. Christopher, you can go ahead and take us offline.
Sign us off. All right. Bye, everyone.